Hey everyone, welcome back to another video from A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the best captain, vice captain options and potential pods to be considering from round 2. Let's get into the video. So starting off with vice captains, now a quick little note, so with SuperCoach we've got vice captains and captains, and there is something called the vice captain loophole, which basically gives you a chance at nailing your captaincy pick 2 times in the week. Now, there's quite a few resources already out there that explain the vice captain loophole and how to best use it. So what I'll do is I'll just link it in the description, some useful articles that do discuss it, and I'll just save some time here. But yeah, definitely do check those out. I think the SC Playbook has got a really good one on their site that I've used in the past. And then there are also some good tools and calculators to help make the decision as to when the loophole is best used. So I'll link those in the description below. Definitely do check those out. But we'll start off with a few vice captain options, and it goes without saying that players that we can consider as a vice captain are also good potential just straight captain options. So we'll start off with Cam Munster. They play the first game against the Eels on Thursday night. And the way that the Storm played and the way they came out of the blocks last round against the Rabbitohs, I could fully expect them to do a similar performance again. They are playing away from home, which is a bit of a downside, but the Storm are a quality team, and the way that Cam Munster took the line on and was able to score that early try, he actually did seem a little bit quiet for the rest of the game, but that's what it shows you. He doesn't seem to have to do a lot, and he'll just rack up easy points. And so I think potentially he might come more into the fore in this game. And so I think given that they are playing early on Thursday night, he then does become a good vice captain option. I mean, one caveat, I guess, to having Munster as the vice captain is that the Eels are also a pretty good team. In terms of how the Eels play against opposing 5'8", they're actually like one of the best teams in the comp. There's only like 5 or 6 other teams that are better at defending against 5'8s based on kind of 2020 statistics. So I think that potentially does have a bit of a downside, but then you could also make the argument that Cam Munster is probably the number 1 5'8 in the comp, so it doesn't really matter who he versus. So I think he could be a bit of a punty vice captain option because he does have that potential to go large. Unfortunately, he didn't play against the Eels anytime last year, so it's hard to kind of have a metric as how he performed against them last time. Next up, we got David Fifita. I think I'm actually really I don't have Fifita in my team, but if you did, he is a really good kind of potential, really high upside vice captain play for this round. He's coming up against the Broncos. I think he'll really want to put in a good performance coming against his old side. It was found out last week that he was coming off an ankle infection, so that did hamper a bit of his pre-match against the Warriors. And it didn't seem like he was that involved, but he still scored 60. And I think if he has now a full week of prep coming against his old team, playing at home as well, I think he has the potential to have a really, really big game, potentially be getting into the hundreds. And in terms of how the Broncos actually defend edge forwards, they were the 3rd worst team in the comp at defending that position. So that does bode well for someone like Fifita. If he's got the ability to make some strong runs on the edge, I think he could have really high upside and could really be a good vice captain option this round. Nathan Cleary next up. I think he's going to be a very, very commonly vice captain player, given that they're playing against the Bulldogs, and he'll probably do, the Panthers are probably going to do well in that game, which means that Cleary is going to do well as himself. In terms of how the Bulldogs actually face up against halfbacks, they were the 5th worst team in the comp in defending the halfback, and they're going up against arguably the best halfback in the comp. The Panthers didn't seem to miss a beat last round against the Cowboys. They kind of just picked up where they left off from last season, and so I fully expect them to run up a score. The only potential downside, I think, is that in Sydney area, the weather is predicted to be kind of wet over the weekend. That does traditionally kind of lower the points across games and potentially limit the upside of some attacking players. But I still think he's going to be a safe vice captain option, even a potential captain option. I think he'll be very commonly captained as well. And he's coming off a 103-point performance from the last round, so he's got the SuperCoach form, and the Panthers have the in-game form too. Next up, we've got the 2 Rabbitohs boys, Cody Walker and Latrell. Both coming up against the Sea Eagles. Seeing the Sea Eagles concede so many points, and with the Rabbitohs attack looking really strong as well against the Storm, who have a very good defense, I fully expect the Sea Eagles to concede a lot of points against the Rabbitohs. And the way that the Rabbitohs attack with Walker and Latrell on the left, I can fully expect them to be getting big scores this round. What does work work in their favour as well is how Manly actually defended last season against their respective positions. They were the fourth worst in the comp against defending 5'8", and second worst in defending the fullback position. So I think that makes Latrell a bit of a punt vice-captain option who really could go big this round. It's not ideal that, your other fullback might potentially be James Tedesco, who we'll touch on maybe in a little bit, because you might want to be a good captain option. So, putting the VC on Latrell means you can't captain Teddy, so it is a big risk, but I think it's one that has a lot of potential upside. And he scored 117 last round against the Storm. Now coming up against the Sea Eagles, he could easily go back-to-back and turn up in both games. So I think Latrell is going to be a really good vice-captain option. If it weren't for, say, Teddy also competing in that fullback spot, I would probably choose Latrell over Cody Walker as my VC. But given that Teddy is there, I think Cody Walker then becomes a bit of a safer VC option. And, he himself scored only, he scored 82 against the Storm. I could easily see him racking up over 100 against the Sea Eagles. In terms of how they played against the Sea Eagles last season, Cody Walker only averaged about 50, but Latrell averaged 141. So you could argue, I think that's also just coming off one game. But I think that does show that Latrell has done well against that team in particular in the past. But I think Cody Walker and Latrell are very, very good VC options if you want to go in that direction. In terms of the captains, due to that vice captain loophole, preferably we're going to be picking our captain who plays a bit later in the round. Hence why I've only got the two here, and they're both from the Roosters. So James Tedesco, I'll just quickly touch on him. Do I really need to say any more? He got 162 last round, came absolutely flying out of the blocks, and he's going up against his old side, the Tigers, which it's been a few years since he's been there, but I think that still kind of reignites a little bit of fire in the belly. You always want to do well up against your old side. Same argument that you could say with David Fafita. So I think Teddy is still going to be a very, very safe captain option. I think he'll be my captain definitely. And in terms of how Tigers defend against fullback, they're kind of middle of the road at the 8th worst team. But with someone like Teddy, I don't really think that matters too much. And I don't know if the Roosters are going to put on the points as much as they did against the Sea Eagles, given that there's that potential for wet weather. I still think, though, that Teddy's a very, very safe captain play. Luke Keary I put here as a bit of a punt captain option. I think, he scored the 70 points last round and looks very involved. And I think, in terms of how the Tigers actually defend the halfback and 5'8" position, they were fourth worst in the comp. So, that does bode well for someone like Keary. And I think, he's already a pod in himself. I think if you went to captain someone like Luke Keary, that really is a big, bold pod move. So if you're that kind of player and you've got him in your side, I think that really could be a player that you potentially could gain up a lot of ground that other players won't really be considering. So I think Luke Keary potentially could be a good punt captain option. But, I think the safe option will be James Tedesco, and with vice captain, either on like Cleary, Cody Walker, or Latrell. Or David Fafita if you want a bit of a punt VC option. So this next little segment I'll call the pod patrol. I did state one of my kind of tips to, improving your overall rank. You don't want to be always just chasing pods, but I do understand that having pods in your team does help you kind of differentiate yourself from the rest of the pack. And if you have a good pod player who does really well, it really does help your ranking overall. So I think it's still good to have a little bit of discussion about pods. So starting off, I've picked out 3 kind of pod forwards. So the first one is Luciano Leilua. I thought he had a really good outing against the Raiders. He looked like a really strong runner of the ball. And in terms of his SuperCoach output, he scored 63 last round, with 53 of that coming in base. So, pretty solid effort in 80 minutes against a pretty tough opponent. In terms of the next 3 games, again, not super easy with the Roosters, the Knights and the Eels as the next 3 teams that he's going to come up against. But I guess for forwards, it doesn't really matter as much as who the opponent is. If anything, that probably means there's going to be a lot more defensive work for him. So you could argue, his points and his base might be a little bit higher. The only downside is potentially that attacking upside with his tries might not be there. But I still think he's a good pod option long term. He's only owned by about 8% of players at the moment. So I think Luciano Leilua, I was really impressed with how he kind of ran the ball and how he looked in general in real gameplay. So I think he's a potential SuperCoach pod option that you can consider bringing into your team. Next up, we've got Mitchell Barnett. It sounds strange to say he's a bit more of an obvious pod than Leilua, given that currently he's owned by less players than Leilua. But, he had a really, really strong game last round, coming up with 105 points, and that was bolstered by his try and his goal kicking. Now, the try and the goal kicking did account for about 50 points, I think, in that 105. So, playing 80 minutes with that base of 50, again, is very similar to Leilua. But given that he does have that goal kicking up until Ponga comes back, I think he does have good upside, and I think he's a good pod. I mean, that 5% ownership I fully expect to go up during the week and during the next few weeks as well. The Knights draw is very favourable, so that means that goal kicking really does boost his overall potential. And with games against the Warriors, who did have a good defensive effort last round against the Titans, so I wouldn't expect maybe as many goal kicks as say against the Bulldogs. But with games against the Tigers and then the Dragons, I think is the key one. I think Barnett then becomes a really good pod option. And I think one that's really going to be heavily backed coming into the next few weeks. So it's kind of funny to call him a bit of a pod, given that, I think there's been a lot of talk around him. If you listen to a lot of other podcasts and things, he's very heavily discussed. But in actual game, he's only owned by about 5% at the moment. I would fully expect that number to increase. But yeah, I think Mitch Barnett, good pod option for the next few weeks. And finally, with the forwards, we've got Lindsay Collins at the Roosters. So at 411k, to be honest, he's not really someone I considered at all before the season, but he had a really good effort last round. Scored 63 points with about 60 of that, I think, coming all in base. And I think he played really big minutes at about 60 minutes last round. I don't know if that would be the same going forward as well. I don't know if maybe last round was an exception, given that, say, Takiaho played a few less minutes than I would have expected. But I think Lindsay Collins, he seems to be, he's coming off some good form. He was able to get into the State of Origin team last season, and he had a really good effort in round one. So, even though he's potentially might get rotated back to the bench, I think with Wira Hargraves, getting up there in age, I think Lindsay Collins could actually hold down maybe that starting front row forward position, and maybe might not be jumping on him straight away this round. It'd be good to maybe have another look and see how his minutes are for this round. But I think going forward, he could be a very, very good pod option, only owned by about 3% of the game at the moment. And at 411k, he is a little bit awkwardly priced, but say for example, if you have Christian Walsh and you're not too happy with his performance, if you're looking to make some money out of him, you could potentially just downgrade to someone like Lindsay Collins and open up 40k. Or if you've got any kind of got some spare cash, say from downgrading Matt Lodge, and you want to upgrade one of your other front row forwards, you could go to someone like Lindsay Collins. So I think he's a decent pod option. In terms of the games, they've got the West Tigers, the Rabbitohs, and the Warriors in the next three. But again, as I mentioned, for forwards, I don't think it matters as much as to who the opponent is. Either way, the Roosters are a quality side. You can always expect them to be rolling forward, and Lindsay Collins to be getting a lot of run meters and hit ups. So I think he's a very good, interesting pod option to see how he goes over the next few weeks. In terms of the backs, Luke Keary is getting another mention. I seem to be super keen on Luke Keary, guys. But I think in terms of the backs, he's one of the less owned halfback, and he does have that dual 5'8" halfback listing, which does come in handy down the line. At 528k, a little bit on the more expensive side. I think the way that the Roosters, the form that they showed against the Sea Eagles, I've got a lot of confidence in their play. And even though some of those games in that next three are kind of tough, with say the Rabbitohs and the Warriors showing their defensive effort, I still think someone like Keary, who looks like he's got the keys to the Roosters' attack, he was fully involved in everything. I think he does have that potential to have really big upside scores, but that also does come with some low scores, which you just kind of have to, factor in when you're picking him into your team. But I think at 8% owned, it's quite surprising to see him that low owned, given that a lot of the time, players who are very good in real life, such as Luke Keary, that really means that their ownership gets bolstered by other players picking them, or based on that alone. But for SuperCoach, he does have that kind of inconsistency. But I think he's a very interesting pod option. I think the way that the form that the Roosters showed, I think I've got a lot of faith in their attack, and Keary would be a linchpin to that. So yeah, pretty interesting pod option. Next up, I've got Jerome Luai. I mean, this kind of doesn't really feel like too much of a pod, given that he's kind of popular and he is discussed a lot, but he's still only owned by about 9% of the game, so it's less than 10%. And I think the Panthers draw and the form that they showed last round against the Cowboys, they look like their attack is still clicking on all cylinders, and Luai looked really good down that left side. Coming off a 79-point effort last round, and they've got the Bulldogs this week. Storm, yes, that is a tough game, but then they've got the Sea Eagles. So 2 out of those next 3 games are very, very favourable for the Panthers. And so someone like Jerome Luai, I think, he could really go up in value over the next few weeks. Kind of regretting that I didn't go with him instead of Dylan Brown to begin the season. I still could make that Brown to Luai switch, but it does seem a bit sideways. But yeah, it doesn't really feel like a pod too much with Luai, but at 9%, I still would put him into that pod category below less than 10%. So I think Luai, very, very good pod option. Don't really have to talk about him too much. I think everyone knows that he looks like he's going to be an absolute SuperCoach gun. And finally, we've got Joey Manu. So I think Joey Manu, I was kind of tossing up whether I wanted to put Joey Manu or Brett Morris. I just feel like a lot of the Roosters backline don't get a lot of love in terms of their ownership. Someone like Brett Morris, obviously he's a lot more expensive at like 630k, but he showed that his price tag can be justified. He's got 125 points last round. And Manu, I think he scored 73 last round, and I didn't think he didn't get a try nor a try assist. So a lot of that was just coming from base, and then his ball running. ball playing, and I think a lot of his involvement in the attack in general. And he's typically someone, I think, over the past few seasons, he's gradually been increasing his average every year. And in real life, he just seems to be getting better and better. Like, I really highly rate him as a real life player. It just sometimes doesn't always translate into Supercoach. I think what does happen with Manu, if he's ever able to fill in at fullback instead of Tedesco, say if Tedesco's been rested or at Origin, Manu does seem to put up amazing numbers. I think he consistently gets into the 100-point barrier when he's playing at fullback. But Manu, I think, someone to keep in the back of your mind. If you want to go for a bit of a pod center option, say for example, if you've got Brian Kelly, you need to trade him out after his injury. Someone I haven't mentioned is Brian To'o, who's owned by about 5%, so he himself is a pod. I think he's still getting a lot of discussion, but I feel like Manu isn't really being talked about at all. And I think, he is cheaper than To'o, and that's an easy downgrade from Brian Kelly to Manu. And I think the Roosters draw long term is pretty favourable. And I think, if you're willing to kind of ride those inconsistencies, I think he has that potential to give you some good 80, 90-point scores. So Manu, I think, one of those guys who I think I really rate as a real life player and could be a very sneaky pod in your centre wing. Well, that's it, guys. Made it to the end of the video. Hopefully you guys kind of like this kind of content where I talk about, some captain, vice captain and pod options. Do let me know in the comments below if you do like to see this, instead of just kind of going through the team list and my kind of team and my trade thoughts. Yeah, so I would really appreciate it if you leave in the comments below, like, if you do like this kind of content, and then they'll let me know what kind of stuff I should keep creating for you guys. But if you did like this video, please would really appreciate a thumbs up and a like on the video. And please do consider subscribing, as I'll be continuing to put out videos throughout the 2021 SuperCoach season. But until then, see you guys in the next video.